So we started Advent last week by looking at the servant songs out of Isaiah, in which we learned about this servant, who we interpret as, of course, Jesus, as someone who is about establishing justice, making things right, calling out the false things and bringing the things that are true and good and fit with God's purposes, and yet doing that in a tender way, in a way which does not have ends justifying means, that takes care of the least and the broken, because that is, of course, who justice is ultimately for in God's mind. So we're going to look this week at the second of these servant songs, when we're going to kind of emphasize some different things about Jesus. We are in Isaiah chapter 49 now. Listen to me, coastlands. Pay attention, peoples far away. The Lord called me before my birth, called my name when I was in my mother's womb. He made my mouth like a sharp sword and hid me in the shadow of God's own hand. He made me a sharpened arrow and concealed me in God's quiver, saying to me, "You are my servant, Israel, in whom I show my glory." But I said, "I've wearied myself in vain. I have used up my strength for nothing. Nevertheless, the Lord will grant me justice. My reward is with God. And now the Lord has decided, the one who formed me from the womb as his servant, to restore Jacob to God, so that Israel might return to him. Moreover, I'm honored in the Lord's eyes. My God has become my strength." And he said, "It is not enough, since you are my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to bring back the survivors of Israel. Hence, I will appoint you as a light to the nations, so that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. The Lord, Redeemer of Israel and its Holy One, says to the one despised, rejected by nations, to the slave of rulers, kings will see and stand up. Commanders will bow down on account of the Lord who is faithful, the Holy One of Israel who has chosen you. The Lord said, "At the right time I answered you, and on the day of salvation I helped you. I have guarded you and given you as a covenant to the people, to restore the land and to reassign deserted properties, saying to prisoners, 'Come out,' and to those in darkness, 'Show yourselves.' Along the road animals will graze. Their pasture will be on every treeless hilltop. They won't hunger or thirst. The burning heat and sun won't strike them, because one who has compassion for them will lead them. He will guide them by springs of water. I will turn all my mountains into roads. My highways will be built up. Look, these will come from far away. Look, these from the north and the west, and these from the southland. Sing, heavens, rejoice, earth. Break out, mountains, with a song. The Lord has comforted his people and taken pity on those who suffer." I love this passage. It's so beautiful, and there's just so much going on. We'll try to kind of briefly look at some of these things. So the first couple of verses here uses kind of these two military images for this servant, and I think they both focus kind of on two aspects. One is both effectiveness, like these are useful tools, they are going to get the job done, right? Which we saw last week a little bit too, just the effectiveness of the servant in these passages. But both also have an interesting kind of focus on not just their effectiveness, but also their hiddenness. The fact that they are effective, but not recognized, not acknowledged for this. So listen again. Listen to me, coastlands. Pay attention, peoples far away. The Lord called me before my birth and called me when I was in my mother's womb. So this calling, this identity is an important long-term one by God. And he made my mouth like a sharp sword, and he hid me in the shadow of God's own hand. He made me a sharpened arrow and concealed me in God's quiver. And so it just strikes me as an interesting combination of, again, the calling that is on the servant, that is on Jesus' life. He had a big job to do in changing God's entire relationship to humanity, right? He was going to get the job done that humanity was not capable of doing. Even this chosen humanity, this country, this group of people of Israel, who were meant to kind of stand in for all of humanity. God himself has to stand in. And so there's a really incredible call on Jesus' life. And I think at times we can have parallel calls as well. I think we can understand that we are called we are called to do certain things. We have certain passions that God desires for us and for our lives. And yet, so much of the time when we are in those callings, we can take ourselves a little bit too seriously. We can want to be recognized for the things that we do, for the things that we think we are great at. And I was struck in this passage is an interesting arrow of both the effectiveness of the call, but also the fact that Jesus is not going to be acknowledged for this. The fact that people will misunderstand who he is will not always do that. And I was reminded of the writer Dallas Willard's what he called a discipline of secrecy. The fact that it's really good for us not always to be acknowledged, to do our work, to follow our calling, to do the things God would have us do without getting credit for it, without being acknowledged. It's just a very different, and I think good for us way of thinking compared to just this kind of constant need for affirmation that we often have in our culture. 1 second, the camera seems to be slipping a little. There, less of my forehead. This next section is an interesting contrast, especially compared to what we were just talking about, the efficacy, and yes, the secretness, the willingness to be misunderstood that Jesus has. And yet we hear Jesus' attitude in the midst of this effectiveness, and it just sounds very different than we are going to expect. But I said, I have wearied myself in vain, and I have used up my strength for nothing. The discouragement there and the feeling that I've tried so hard and they're getting no results from it is fascinating, just in that it seems to be one of the marks of humanity, right? Jesus experienced even these feelings of doubt and failure, that things were not working out the way that they were supposed to. And I think you can say that that was a fairly accurate description of Jesus' ministry from many people's point of view, right? He was a loser. He did not start this revolution he seemed to be trying to do. He had a group of confused disciples at the end of his life who didn't really understand his teaching, his way of being in the world. And then he was killed. The leadership, the people themselves rejected him, and he died. And obviously we know that's not the end of the story. But you can hear in here, I think, this attitude of discouragement, and I think this assessment by many people, sometimes even Jesus himself, of failure of what his actual goal was. And yet this servant song does not stop there. It continues. But I said, I've wearied myself in vain, and I've used up my strength for nothing. Nonetheless, the Lord will grant me justice. My reward is with my God. And now the Lord has decided, the one who formed me from his womb as his servant, to restore Jacob to God, so that Israel might return to him. Moreover, I'm honored in the Lord's eyes. My God has become my strength. And he said, it is not enough, since you are my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob, to bring back the survivors of Israel. Hence I will also appoint you as a light to the nations, so that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. So interesting. And it seems to be such a pattern in here that this failure actually becomes the thing that God uses to do something brand new and to work. And he says, in the end, God is my strength, my reward is with God. And so where the job seems to be throughout the book of Isaiah, and a sense that Jesus had as well, was restoring God's people back to him, back to the way they were meant to be, was a huge chunk of what his calling was, that he was trying to do with his life. And yet, God the Father takes what looks like a failure and says, no, actually, this dream, this job, this calling, which is here, isn't actually even big enough. I don't want to just restore God's people. I don't want to just restore Israel. I want to restore everyone and everything. The entire family of humanity is being invited back into the kingdom of God. And this contrast is just so interesting of this thing that looks like a failure. Ultimately, in Jesus' case, it's the cross, right? The fact that he is tortured and murdered publicly. This ultimate failure, this ultimate rejection by the world of God's ways and God's ways of doing things is, of course, the vehicle that God the Father is going to use to break the power of sin and death, and make possible the restoration of all of humanity. And I think that paradigm of God taking what feels like an utter failure, and maybe even is an utter failure in the world's eyes or our own eyes, and making that the vehicle of which something brand new in restoration is completed, is such an important part of both the Christmas story and the Easter story, and overall the Christian story, recognizing that failure is not just an end, is not just something we can overcome, but something that God actively uses, and I think often can't use anything else because we'll try to rely on ourselves, on our own strengths. God needs to use these places where we are humble and we're able to listen well to bring something good out of it. And I don't think that means that bad things happen to our lives, failures, tragedies are in of themselves good things. They are not. As we're going to see in this next section, they are foreign to God's plan, God's desires for, I think, both our lives and the world overall. But that doesn't mean that our suffering, our failures, our frustrations are meaningless. God can give them meaning by taking even that which is most broken and bringing something truly beautiful and truly good out of it, and which we're going to see kind of as this song continues. The Lord, Redeemer of Israel and its holy name, says to the one despised, rejected by nations, to the slave of rulers, kings will see and stand up. Commanders will bow down on account of the Lord who is faithful, the Holy One of Israel who has chosen you. The Lord said, at the right time I answered you. On the day of salvation I helped you. I have guarded you and given you as a covenant to the people, to restore the land and to reassign deserted properties, saying to the prisoners, come out, and to those in darkness, show yourselves. Along the roads animals will graze. Their pasture will be on every treeless hilltop. They won't hunger or thirst. The burning heat and sun won't strike them, because the one who has compassion for them will lead them and will guide them by springs of water. I will turn all my mountains into roads, and my highways will be built up. Look, these will come from far away. Look, these from the north and the west, and these from the southland. Sing, heavens, rejoice, earth, break out, mountains, with song. The Lord has comforted his people and has taken pity on those who suffer. This section has just such a beautiful affirmation of the one who is rejected is going to be used to bring about restoration. It's playing on a couple images there. One of is which is the Exodus, right? The first, maybe not first, but one of the most defining actions of God in history. He took a group of people who were utterly beaten down, utterly broken slaves, defeated this powerful empire, defeated even, symbolically powers of chaos and nature in the crossing of the Red Sea, to make them into something brand new for the sake of the rest of humanity. God called the losers, the lost, the broken, and made something brand new out of them. And you can hear language in here of a new kind of exodus, a new kind of gathering of people out of other places, right? You hear in here this beautiful shepherd imagery, which is all throughout the Old Testament and even picked up again in Jesus' own teachings, of God walking alongside his people, even as he calls them out of the exile, even as they find themselves in deserts and wilderness, and in both the literal sense in the original Exodus and in the figurative sense of places in life that feel like that. And God walks alongside them and he brings abundance even in the midst of the desert, even in the midst of these wildernesses, places where people feel unsafe and they can't. And there's a gathering. People are no longer going to be separated. People are no longer going to be lost and apart, and we are all going to be gathered. There's a kind of a home being built here in this passage. And I think this passage is such a beautiful one because it tells us kind of the dream God has for humanity, of using that cross, of using that which was broken, of using what feels like failure and bringing complete restoration, calling people out of darkness, as we heard last week, calling those who cannot see or blind and deaf, and healing and fixing them, as we saw Jesus do in his life so many times. This dream is one that's going to be picked up again in the book of Revelation at the end of the Bible. This dream of God with us, of God restoring and fixing all things. We are still on that journey. We are still journeying towards this home. We are still journeying towards full restoration. And in the midst of that journey, there is a lot of brokenness. There is a lot of failure. Some of it is our own fault. Some of it is just living in the world we are in when people and the things that we partake in either do this to us or we participate in, whether willingly or unwillingly. And yet, all this brokenness, all these mistakes, all these failures are things that God is incorporating into wholeness, that is incorporating into a new way of being into the world and into the kingdom. And so this passage I just find so inspiring. The Lord has comforted his people and taken pity on those who suffer. That's not an either or. Those things are both happening constantly. Those things are happening in both Jesus' life and his feelings of frustration and failure and torture on the cross. And it can be true in smaller versions of our own lives. And so I think we just need to ask ourselves this question, because many of us, reading this passage know this story. We know this story. But do we truly believe and trust this in our heart of hearts? Do we really believe that God works out of failure most of the time? Because I think he doesn't have a lot else to work with most of the time in our world, right? Do we really trust God with our own weaknesses and failures? Or do we try to cover them up? Do we try to justify them? Do we kind of hope that they will go away and be fixed? Do we trust that God can use those things and bring wholeness and restoration and beauty out of them? If we can't trust God with our own weaknesses and failures, do we trust God with the bigger ones, the weaknesses and failures of the world or the church? Maybe the church in America right now, there's a lot to criticize, and a lot of people are very angry at kind of the modern church's handling of many things. Do we trust God's work through the failures of the systems, whether the economic systems in the world, whether racial and other types of injustice that are in the world? God is not defeated by those things. And again, that's not to say that they are good or part of God's plan. But do we trust truly God can bring something whole and beautiful out of that which is deeply wrong, deeply broken in the world? And do our lives really look like lives that are defined by trust, that God is with us in the now, that God is going to be one to provide? Or is there an anxiety and a fear that things are going to be wrong, that I'm going to be found out, that thing I did wrong or those things I don't like about myself in the end are going to get me? It's going to be too much. I won't be able to recover from this place I find myself in or the failures I see coming on, right? Do we live in a place that says God is with us on this journey, bringing abundance out of those things? Or are we afraid or not? And so I just think that is the opportunity we are giving in this passage again, to say this is actually how God works, bringing beauty and wholeness out of failure, our own, those in the world, even those in Jesus' life when he was rejected and killed on the cross, right? Do we really believe this is the way God works? And I think the invitation of God is again saying, trust me, this is in fact how I work. This is my dream, one of wholeness, of enoughness, of restoration. Let's try and walk into this and trust a little bit more this week in Advent.